Symbology. It's very important to us. I mean, it conveys meaning, and we definitely will jump into that today. But it can convey much more than simply meaning. It can convey great emotion. A colleague, perhaps 2 or 3 months ago, said he chided me softly that I didn't have an American flag, representing my nationality, and I think that that's fair game. We now have an American flag here representing my nationality, but moreover representing my father, who has passed away a couple of years ago as a 20-plus year military veteran in the United States Army, an NCO, Vietnam veteran with 3 tours of Southeast Asia, as well as many deployments all over the world. And my father's flag is now on the set with us. Let's get into map, icons, and symbols. I'm Dr. Christopher Larsen, a veteran of the U.S. Army Infantry, founder of One Shepherd Leadership Institute, and author of Small Unit Tactical Doctrine. Okay, map symbology, right? Map symbols. I'll confess that I saw these used in my early years in the Army, but I probably was something in the nature of, 22 years old, probably had at least 3, if not 4 years under my belt in the United States military, and then went off to yet another NCO academy before I started to really be able to understand them. I knew the infantry, I knew which ones, symbolized us, and I knew the difference between the good guys, the blue 4, and the bad guys, the OPFOR. But it's vastly more complicated than that. We're not going to go into it that deep today, but let's get a rudimentary understanding, just so that we're all on the same sheet of music. I'm going to share with you NATO symbology. So NATO symbology starts with, good guys look like this. I'm not a great artist, and that's not a perfect triangle. Did I just say triangle? That's not a perfect rectangle. You can see it's rectangular, and so that is the good guys. That's the blue 4, right? And it represents friendly forces, typically U.S. forces, but it can also show allies. And this diamond is the OPFOR. That's the bad guys. Now, I just said it shows allies. Actually, green is allied. And I believe it's called green is allied and yellow is unknown, if I recall correctly. But in some colloquialisms, the quote-unquote green layer refers to civilians. It depends on context. But what doesn't depend on context, at least in NATO, is the blue and the red. Blue are good guys, red are bad guys. And so now what we do is we start filling in the inside to tell me, okay, well, that's the bad guy and this is the good guy, but what about them? What else are they? Very common since the beginning of time, you have infantry. Infantry have an X in the middle of it. Think of that as crossed rifles. And you go, oh, well, then that makes sense. Maybe it's crossed rifles. Whatever it is, it's an X. But what if I wanted, you have light infantry, I could indicate that. I could come over here and I could put an L. Sometimes they just put an L in either one of those. I won't bother with that because L is pretty self-evident. But that would be light infantry. And without putting an L, I've already kind of implied that, that it's light. And it's furthermore implied if you have mounted infantry. And the icon for that is simply something like a tank tread. Think of World War I, right? And that's like a tank tread with crossed rifles over the top of it. Well, it isn't a tank if it has crossed rifles over it, so now I've got mounted infantry. And it looks remarkably similar here. All I'd have to do is come over here and say, well, if I want to make that mounted, I just put the tank treads here. Kind of an oval. Is there other types of infantry? Lots. We could say, let's do air assault. Often can be AA. I could have put MNT, which is mountain. This is air assault. Airborne infantry. Well, let's do airborne mounted infantry. Is there such a thing? Yes, actually, it's pretty darn rare, but there are battalions and regiments that are airborne. And airborne is usually a double hump. Now, it's typically on the bottom, but sometimes expressed up there. Think of like a childish drawing of a seagull or something like that. And there you go. So I've got air assault light infantry up here. I've got airborne mounted infantry. We could have put, you know, an R means ranger, MNT means mountain, L means light. So you can dress them up and start to talk about what kinds they are. And again, equally here. We could have come in and said, okay, well, these are going to be our, I don't know, the old style Soviet airborne mounted infantry. See, same thing. We say, well, that's a lot of different types of infantry. And there are. What else are there? Well, I already showed you what it looks like to be mounted. So this is armor. Generally means tanks. Can be a little more vague than that, but it generally means tanks. That's armor right there. You say, well, okay, that's armor, and it can have many different indicators on it. Can it be airborne armor? Once again, believe it or not, even the United States military had this at one time with the M551 Sheridan, right? With the 82nd Airborne, way back in the day. So you have armor, and you have something very, very similar. You have cavalry. Now that's a kind of a mix. Armor usually does indicate tanks. Cavalry can indicate tanks, or it can indicate a lighter reconnaissance tank, or you know, it gets really close to mounted infantry, but it's not quite that. It's kind of the hybrid in between. Okay, but back in, let's go back to the days of, I don't know, Roman Empire. This would be horses, and this still could be horses as well, right? So this is really, the tank is really a modern, you know, incarnation, but nonetheless, we would understand that as cavalry. We would still understand this as light and heavy infantry. Even way back then, they still had those distinctions, right? So it's gotten more sophisticated and more, you know, technologically advanced, but that's still pretty much there. Well, we also had back in the day, and still today, we have artillery. Yep, just a big dot right there. And you go, wow, artillery. Are there variations of that? Well, of course there are. There's air assault artillery that's slung load into it. There's airborne artillery that's dropped into a drop zone. And oh yeah, don't be too terribly surprised when you see armored artillery, self-propelled 155 guns, etc., right? The Paladin today, the M109, God knows which variation, but the Paladin would definitely be indicated like this. Light and heavy infantry, one might say light and heavy cavalry or armor. We can have pulled artillery, air assault, air dropped, so vertical envelopment artillery, or we can have good old-fashioned mounted heavy artillery. I'm saying, yes, that's correct, artillery. We've got infantry, we've got cavalry and armor, we've got artillery. Well, that's your basics, but it's certainly not the only. Let's not forget that we have all sorts of engineers, which is usually just a great big E. Like that. Now you say, well, that's engineer. That actually indicates a heavy engineer, and we could put, you know, armor on it or something like that. But if we want to show that they're combat engineers, we put a CBT underneath it. Combat engineers. And that could be many different things. That could be everything from sappers, which are light, to mobile assault bridges and ferries. So, you know, you can put in minefields, or it could even mean, you know, explosive ordnance disposal. All of that follows under your combat engineers, of course. So there's many different ways of designating that with each icon. And again, each one of these is represented over here. I'll just kind of do, here you go. There's a cavalry. We want to get a little cheeky about it. We can say it's air assault cavalry. We can say, down here, we can say, well, let's do artillery. And then there's different ways of showing wheeled. You can do it this way. Maybe we want to do an artillery to show that it's a wheeled artillery or a pulled artillery, something like that. Believe it or not, boom. So we can do different things like that. They will have a similar sort of thing. They'll have a big E, right? And then they might put an H or an HVY for heavy. And you say, well, what's that? Well, those are guys who are like quite literally laying in train tracks or putting in airfields, or they're moving great big bulldozers and stuff like that. So you're seeing all of this, you're going, wow, okay. What else is there? Well, there's aviation. I mean, you know, you have combat aviation, good grief. I'm trying mostly to stick to the ground forces. Your aviation is your, you know, your heavy lift, your utility aviation. You have attack aviation. Should probably give you the icon for that. That's aviation. And again, you can have fixed wing, you can have rotary wing and stuff like this, but this is aviation. ATK. So if I put CBT, combat aviation, that might indicate, you know, chances are it indicates right now Blackhawks for the Army. All right, it would indicate the newest variation of the Huey for the Marines, right? And so that would be a combat aviation, right? Door gunners, and they're bringing troops into the battle and stuff like that. Why ATK, attack, instead of combat? Aren't they synonymous? Somewhat. But attack aviation specifically means for the Marines, it would mean, you know, whatever variation they have of the Cobra gunship, the Super Cobra, and whatever the latest variation of the Apache gunship, you know, that for the Army. But anyway, so those are specifically, well, they're tank killers originally. They were designed to be tank killers, but they are ground attack, close air support. Okay, so you see you can get into that. You can get into the administrative side, or combat service support, CSS, combat support. This is, oh, good grief, these are your special service battalions. It can include CASH, Combat Army Surgical Hospitals, you know, all sorts of stuff. So it gets really advanced. And again, there's always the opposite side, just put into, those icons put into this symbology of the red diamond. And that means the OPFOR, the bad guys, right? All right, well, that's pretty cool. But there's a whole lot more information that can be here. What we've done now is you're going, wow, I can see whether they're friendly or foe. I can see what type of organization there is, but I haven't given myself any real indication of its size, which also, of course, indicates capability. I'm going to do this right here. So let's do it a little bigger. I want to get into it. And I'll do it a little bigger here. Okay, let's start getting into sizes. So, first one I'm going to go into is this, an empty dot above. That means fire team or crew, a gun crew, a mortar crew, a rocket crew, hell, a flamethrower crew. I mean, it's a crew-served weapon, or far more commonly, it means a fire team. And of course, a fire team is 3 to 5 people, typically right around 4. Well, what if I fill that dot in? And again, this is still true for the OPFOR. What if I fill that in? What if it's a solid dot? Well, now it's a squad. And so a squad typically means 2 or more crews. So 2 or 3 of these equal a squad. All right, simple enough. Well then, hold on, then let's just stay with that. So that's 1. But what if it has 3? I think this will be pretty logical if you've watched my unit size video. If that's 1 squad, that's 3 squads. What has 3 squads? And of course the answer is a platoon. A platoon has 3 squads. So fire team, squad, platoon. But of course, you know, you're probably asking, well, that's all fine and well, but once in a blue moon I see this odd animal. And, you know, someone's going to ask, well, what's 2 dots? Yeah, so there's 2 ways of expressing what this is. This is, a lot of people say, a platoon minus. That's one way to describe it. A platoon minus 1 squad. Say 1 squad is off on reconnaissance. And so they're far, far away, 12 kilometers away, and not able to impact any engagement this platoon minus gets in. That is certainly a way of saying it. More doctrinally, this is actually called a section for U.S. forces. Again, NATO wouldn't necessarily agree with that, and certainly not the Commonwealth, which section means squad. Squad, section, they're synonymous. For us, a section is larger than a squad, but smaller than a platoon. So a section. Fire team, squad, section or platoon minus, platoon. That's what those mean. Hey, simple enough. Well, what's bigger than a platoon? And you know the answer. You're saying, well, what's bigger than a platoon is a company. Okay. And by the way, we could say these are aviation, we could say they're medical, we could say they're, cavalry or infantry or artillery. Artillery and aviation use slightly different words. They talk about squadrons and troops, and that gets a little confusing, and I'm not going to try and delve into all of that today. But even though they sometimes use different terminology, they recognize that they follow the same, linear hierarchical patterns and sizes. So anyway, a straight line is a company. 2 lines. Well, that's a battalion. Okay, yeah, three companies in a battalion, so I guess the next thing up is a battalion. So if that's a battalion, then what's that? Why wouldn't, this is 3 squads make a platoon, wouldn't that be 3 companies make a battalion? No, because the 2 actually means battalion, and the 3rd means regiment. Now remember, you're saying, oh, a brigade. Oh, almost. A regiment is pure. It's going to be an attack aviation regiment, or it's going to be an artillery regiment, or it's going to be, an air assault infantry regiment. It's going to be more or less pure to that specialty, like we would call it a military occupational specialty, that MOS. And this harkens way back into the day, long before we had combined arms and all of this stuff. Regimental systems are very old and great tradition. But when I want to plus up this air assault infantry regiment of, let's say, 3 600-man battalions, we're at 1,800, we throw a 200-man headquarters onto it, it's 2,000 men. But hold on, I want to plus it up. I want to give it some combat engineers and some artillery. I might back it up with either cavalry and or with some attack aviation or combat aviation, right? I want to plus it up and back it up with some real assets that it can use. Maybe MP, by the way. Military police has a box, and surprise, surprise, it says MP, military police. And they have a combat mission too, for protecting the regiment rear, right? Brigade rear areas. You don't usually see them down at battalion level, but it's not impossible. They can be attached to a battalion. Anyway, so if I want to plus this up, and I want to say, okay, you're 2,000 infantry, but I'm going to give you 500 artillery, I'm going to give you, 300 combat engineers, I'm going to give you your own medical, your own, whatever it is. Maybe a special service battalion, right? And suddenly I went from 2,000, and I'm going up easily 3,500 all the way up to 5,000. Now that's a really big brigade, but that's, we could get there. Typically your brigade, 1X, is, again, 3,000 to 5,000. But a regiment's going to be smaller, typically 1,500 to 2,000, very typically, okay? So it's just a plussed up regiment is the easy way to think of a brigade. It's a composite unit. And really, from the regiment on, everything is composite. It's not very often today, since the global war on terror and all this other stuff, we've moved into the BCT, the brigade combat teams and stuff like this. So just seeing a pure regiment train where that was a thing when I was in is pretty rare nowadays. And I have to admit that when I was in, we formed into regiments, pure regiments, but the reality was that we did not field that way. We fielded, we had so many assets attached to us that we were by default a brigade combat team. So, it hasn't changed that radically. But anyway, that's still around. And from brigade on, we're composite teams. That means we just throw everything into the pile. You go, okay, well, sure, you got your brigade, but what's bigger than a brigade? Well, 2 or more brigades, 2 to 5, will be a division. And what's bigger than a division? And division being typically 10 to 12,000 is really your normative numbers. Can it be smaller? Yes. Can it be larger? Yes. But 10 to 12,000. Okay. And so when we plus up a division and we say, we're going to do typically 3 divisions or more, and we get into the Corps. Now that's going to have 3 divisions. It might have special, standalone, separate special support brigades thrown in on it. So very, very typically, you're looking at, you know, oh, good grief, low ball would be 30,000, 50,000 would be more close to correct. Very typically, when you look at all the other assets attached, you know, 50,000 troops would be a corps. It's not unheard of to see them larger than that. So this is really quite big. You know, a corps can be as, I guess I'm thinking that, I'm trying to remember historically where I saw that, but you know, I saw a corps one time on a map, and they were saying, yeah, you know, whatever corps that is was 70,000. I thought, wow, that's really big for a corps. But it happens. It happens because, I should mention, because at this point, there's another term that comes into our lexicon, and it's called the Joint Task Force. And you go, wait, I saw this movie once where the whole Joint Task Force was super ninja special forces guys, and I go, okay, well, special forces alone kind of throws this whole thing on its ear because they have a fundamentally different structure. But that aside, Joint Task Force, yeah, you can have them down at the battalion level. And if they're a political non-combat thing, you might have a Joint Task Force at a company level. Okay, but I'm saying for combat, kinetic warfare and conflict, Joint Task Force really, I think this is where they've been the most successful, is up at corps level. And maybe that's why you sometimes see these corps up at like 70, 75,000, because they really aren't. They're a corps plussed up by allies and, you know, and all these other stuff, and you go, wow, now it's a JTF, a Joint Task Force. But I want to show that sometimes they're used interchangeably, and you think about it, that makes sense, because these often are covering down on, if not an entire theater, you know, depending on the type of war and when, certainly they cover down a substantial part of a theater, sometimes the entire theater. Theater of operations is what I mean. So we got the corps, and you know where this goes next. It goes to 4X's. No, not 4X's. You bet, 4X's. And what does that mean? That means Army. So here we go. 4 people to, 150, 200,000. Huge jump. And yet we're able to do it just like that. Fire team. Or crew, squad, section, platoon, company, battalion, regiment, brigade, division, corps, army, and from there we go into army groups. And that is just absolutely insane sizes. But I mean, you look at the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans attack with an army group. So, and the Russians attacked with army groups and all of this stuff. So it certainly does happen. I don't mean to say, well, you'll never read about it. In history you definitely will. But just ginormous forces. And that's essentially their icons. Can you get more information here? Yeah, actually you can. If you're familiar with a guidon, we can start putting information down here. You can say 1st Battalion, 17th Infantry. So these numbers start to mean things as well. And I think there's also, I will butcher this badly, but I will point out that once in a while you'll see something like this. You certainly wouldn't see it here. Let me say, you will see something like this. And you go, oh, what's the little flag mean? And what it means is the commander is with this unit, so the main headquarters is with this unit. Whatever unit it is, we're attaching it to. And what these flags do, if I'm not mistaken, there are 3 types of flags here. Here's the other one. And here's the last one. And each one of them says something like, let me see if I get this right. This is battalion commander, this is the regiment commander, and this is the division commander. I might have those inverted. Someone double check me. But nonetheless, I just want to talk about, so you can give, I wanted to show those to say that there's a whole lot of, information on the margins that tell you more about this. So there's information inside. There's information outside that tells us about what kind of unit that is. And of course, the basic, most basic information we see is simply the shape. Is it a rectangle or is it a diamond? Is it blue or is it red? And that's really just a down and dirty about your map symbology.